We went through these exercises every day in the training area, just going through the motions without live ammunition. The horse handlers, farers, and the gunners, cannoneers, exercised constantly but separately. A gun crew consisted of one gun leader, an Unteroffizier or Unterwachtmeister, 5 cannoneers, and 3 farers. The direction gunner was the key cannoneer because he handled the sighting and the aiming of the gun. The others handled ammunition, loaded the gun, and helped camouflage the gun with branches. After a couple of weeks of the cannoneers and farers practicing separately, we came together for the first time. From then on, farers and cannoneers practiced together daily, and once a week all 4 gun crews would come together and practice as a battery. Christmas was approaching, and we began looking forward to a break in our training routine. Half of us were to get 5 days of furlough at Christmas, and the other half were to get 5 days at New Year's. Rausche, Wohithat, and Bersel drew Christmas furlough, and Weinreich, Vogel, and I received our furloughs at New Year's. When the first group left, just before Christmas, everything seemed suddenly very strange, because our total regimentation had been broken. We had to police the area and keep everything spick and span, but most of our routine training was discontinued until after New Year's, and we had free time to lie around and be lazy. Most of the higher-ranking non-commissioned officers had managed Christmas furloughs, leaving mostly Stabsgefreiters in charge. Stabsgefreiters were a unique group in the German army, because this was a rank reserved for losers, career soldiers who could not handle responsibility and would never hold a rank higher than Stabsgefreiter. Christmas furlough was an opportunity for them to exercise authority, however, and they took full advantage of it. The Stabsgefreiter in charge of us in Kral's absence was Weizsäcker, and we were more than a little apprehensive about him. He seemed to be a very sadistic sort who liked to throw his weight around when he had a rare opportunity. Since Weinreich and I were intellectuals, we knew we would be in trouble if we ever found ourselves at his mercy. Weinreich and I drew stable duty on Christmas Eve. At least we were trusted with pitchforks by now. Stable duty consisted of cleaning the stalls and sorting out the straw. The straw could not be too dirty, so new straw had to be placed on top of the old straw. The underneath mattress of old straw would already be pressed down, and the new straw would be placed on top of that, so the horse would not get dirty when it lay down. The stable had a cement floor, and we had to learn how much straw to take out and how much to leave. About every 3 weeks, all the straw would be removed, the cement floor would be cleaned with water, and all new straw would be put down. An immense amount of new straw was needed to make the required mattress. After enduring the odour of removing the old straw, we found the fresh scent of new straw an unforgettable pleasure. Weinreich and I drew the unenviable duty of removing all the soiled straw from a section of the stall and washing down the cement floor. We had hardly begun when Stabsgefreiter Weizsäcker came marching Vogel into the barn, shouting at him about extra duty. Weinreich and I stopped our work and looked around to see what was happening. The moment we stood up, Weizsäcker pounced on us. "Aha! The intellectuals are loafing!" he shouted gleefully, momentarily forgetting about Vogel. "Well, if you have so much free time, I have a perfect solution especially designed for intellectuals and smart mouths." He grinned at Vogel. Weizsäcker motioned for Vogel to get into the stall with Weinreich and me. "Now, let's see you guys clean this place out with your hands." Our expressions must have reflected our shock, because he grinned even wider. "That's right," he said. "Hang up your pitchforks." Vogel started to protest, but quickly thought better of it. Weizsäcker's half-moon grin was topped by a round, bulbous nose and small, close-set eyes. He was obviously enjoying his rare experience with authority. "I will be back in 30 minutes, he said, "and this stall had better be empty and spotless." He turned and strutted importantly toward the door. Vogel picked up a tiny piece of horse manure and flipped it at the departing Weizsäcker, who fortunately never saw the defiant gesture. We began picking up large sections of packed straw with bare hands, trying unsuccessfully to avoid the overpowering stench of horse urine that arose as the straw was removed, and carrying it to the wheelbarrows. With nearly superhuman effort, we had our part of the stall completely cleaned and washed down when Weissacker returned 30 minutes later. He came stalking into the stable, looking smug and self-important, like the Italian dictator Mussolini in newsreels I had seen. When he saw the empty stall, his face fell. He clearly had thought it would be impossible for us to do the job in 30 minutes and was looking forward to imposing more extra duty on us. He seemed confused upon finding that he had no excuse for further punishment. "It is a damn good thing," he muttered as a way to save face, and stalked out of the stable. It was not exactly an ideal Christmas Eve, but we survived it, and actually in fairly good spirits once the filthy task in the stable was finished. 5 days at the mercy of the Stabsgefreiters left me more than ready for my own furlough. Being home again was very pleasant, however brief. The total lack of regimentation seemed unnatural and strange at first. Having my mother hovering to serve my every wish made me feel that I must be in another world, a dream world. My father was interested in comparing my experience to his experience in the Navy 20 years earlier. Fritz, of course, was fascinated with both sets of stories and sat at our feet as we related them. Inga was friendlier than I could ever remember her being before, but still reserved. Grandma came to visit, of course, and to brag about her handsome young soldier grandchild. My father had got out of the wholesale grocery business and was now operating a restaurant and nightclub. I found Liebelt, Michaelis, and Ebert, and learned from them that Friedrich was also home on furlough. I was delighted that we could all get together for an evening before Friedrich had to return to Dresden, where he was in training to become an officer. Of course, since he was a Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier and I was but a lowly cannoneer, he strutted about, playfully shouting orders at me. "We should plan another ski trip to the Sudeten Mountains when Knappe and Friedrich get out of the army," Liebelt suggested. "I wonder if old Herr Hofer would still be there," Friedrich said. "I don't know if I will still be in Germany," Michaelis said gloomily. "My father is talking seriously about moving to England. He does not trust the Nazis because we are Jewish." "God, I hope you're still here," Ebert said. "It wouldn't be the same without you." "Let's toast the 5 of us, just in case," Michaelis suggested, raising his glass of wine. "To us and to the future." We all drank to Michaelis's toast. Following the wonderfully non-regimented furlough, we quickly fell back into the old routine of training. Actually, the routine felt good to me. Our whole first year was intensive basic training, with manoeuvres in the field once a month. Practice sessions would include pulling the guns, first on the road and then cross-country, and getting into position. The battery commander, a Hauptmann, would select the battery position for the guns, and the lieutenants would get the people into place, select the individual positions for the 4 guns, and camouflage the guns. A team of horses strains under the weight of a heavy artillery piece. In late January 1937, Weinreich and I were selected for training in communications because of our gymnasium education. The battery troop, which was always up front with the infantry, and the gun crews communicated by both wireless radio and telephone. This required a radio operator and a telephone operator up front with the battery troop, and another of each back with the guns. Wireless radio was cutting-edge technology in 1937, and I was very proud to become a radio operator, even if it was in the horse-drawn artillery. My training as a communications man also included measuring angles, estimating distances, and all the things the forward observation officer had to know so that I could do his job if he was killed or badly wounded. Fairly often in combat, the communications man would have to assume these duties, and we practiced this constantly. Now that I was a communications specialist, I had to learn how to ride a horse. As a city dweller, I had to get accustomed to handling these huge animals, but it did not take long. We had to learn to brush and feed the horses, each of us had 2 to look after, and to saddle them. We had riding lessons an hour a day for about 10 weeks, under the tutelage of Obergefreiter Sebastian. It was winter, so we would lead our horses into the covered riding arena. The riding class was 10 to 12 riders, and most of us were new and inexperienced with horses. Leading our horses, we would march into the riding arena and learn how to stand the right distance from each other in a straight line in the middle of the arena. Then we learned how to mount a horse, how to hold the reins, and what to do and not do. In the summer, the battalion, all 3 batteries, came together for the first time, and in late summer we worked together with the infantry for the first time. For this, we had to leave Jena, our garrison town, and go to a military reservation at Jüterbog near Berlin, where we could fire live ammunition. Working with the infantry was the highlight of our training. We seldom practiced with the infantry in garrison because of limited space, with the farms all around. We could practice in the fall after the crops were in, but even then a lot of damage was done and the farmers did not like it. We had to take the farmers' fences down and then put them up again. We had to be very careful with the fences, which was time-consuming and difficult. We marched from Jena to Jüterbog. We were roused out of bed at 4:30 a.m. and had an hour to feed and water the horses and have our own breakfast. Then we hitched the teams to the guns and wagons and moved out. The infantry led the way, with the artillery following. The infantry marched on foot, and we in the artillery either rode on horseback or rode on the guns or wagons. The guns were pulled backward, with their barrels pointing behind us. The battery commander led the 8th Battery on horseback, followed by the forward observation officer with the battery troop. Then came the battery officer with the 4-gun crews and the ammunition and supply wagons. Suddenly we received word that the infantry in front of us had encountered resistance, and we were to deploy and support the infantry. The battery commander and the forward observation officer with the battery troop moved up to join the infantry. After being advised of the infantry battle plan, the battery commander rode back to instruct the battery officer and determine the gun positions, designating the exact spot for each of the 4 guns. The guns were unhitched and positioned by hand by the cannoneers. The ammunition was unloaded from the limbers, which the Fahrers then took back to cover, where they dismounted and cared for their horses. The battery officer selected a reference point that could be seen from the gun position. The forward observation officer selected a target for sighting purposes and gave directions to the battery officer, as well as the position of his reference point, who then gave orders to the gun crew of gun number 2, which did the initial sighting for all 4 guns. After each round, the forward observation officer called back adjustments. When gun number 2 was zeroed in, all the guns fired on the target, live ammunition for the first time, and the roar of the guns was deafening. When we received word that the enemy resistance had been broken, the Fahrers rode back to the gun positions and hitched the horses to the guns. We communications people restored our equipment to their containers and remounted them on our horses. We then resumed our cross-country march, but we were all flushed and excited from actually going through the whole coordinated action and firing live ammunition for the first time. We were considerably less disciplined than we had been before, but only for a short while. We were soon back in our disciplined routine. While we were at Jüterbog, Hitler ordered a big parade for the benefit of Mussolini, who was visiting Germany and whom Hitler wanted to impress with German military might. I think this was one of the few times when a whole division went on parade. As participants, unfortunately, all we saw was dust, with an artillery regiment of 4 battalions totalling 48 cannons, each pulled by a team of 6 galloping horses. Nearly 300 horses and 100 cannon wheels raised so much dust that not only could we not see, we could barely breathe. On the weekends back at Jena, we could get a pass to go to town unless we had stable or guard duty. Weinreich and I had become good friends and usually went to town together. As in labour service, my weekend passes were usually spent in a combination of cultural pursuits and meeting girls and dancing. One day in the spring of 1937, I was instructed to report to Lieutenant Badstubner's office. This was my first personal contact with an officer. I reported to him in his office as ordered, and he cordially invited me to take a seat. I understand that you plan to attend university after your army service, he said. Jawohl, Herr Leutnant, I replied. What would you think about attending a military officer? He asked. In academy and becoming a reserve stead of 2 years, you would have to serve 3. But then you would have no reserve duty obligations and would be completely free to attend university and study. That sounded logical to me, and I was enjoying army life, so why not? Jawohl, Herr Leutnant, I replied. I would like that. Weinreich and 2 other gymnasium grad also been invited to become officer candidates, so we now had additional training, as well as some duties of non-commissioned officers. Lieutenant Badstubner was responsible for our training and special duties. He was only a couple of years older than we were, and not long out of the military academy himself. Our military training was now stepped up. Normally, our second year in the army would have been a repetition of our first, except that in the second year we would have taken over some supervisory duties. But because we were in officer training, we began learning military tactics. We began to learn the observation officers' and battery officers' jobs. We were put into command positions to learn leadership and how to use our voices to command troops. In training new troops, we did the same job as the non-commissioned officers. Some of the non-commissioned officers were friendly, but some of them resented us because they were older and they knew that 1 year later we would be lieutenants and they would still be non-commissioned officers 5 years from now. There were 4 ranks for officer candidates. The ranks were Fahnenjunker Gefreiter, equivalent to Gefreiter, and Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier, equivalent to Unteroffizier, before we went to the academy. Halfway through the military academy, we would become Fähnrich, and at graduation from the academy, we would be promoted to Oberfähnrich, which was almost an officer. On June 1st, as an officer candidate, I became a Fahnenjunker Gefreiter. I would otherwise have qualified for Gefreiter rank only after 1 year. Stabsgefreiter Weizsäcker was bitter at the thought of a first-year recruit suddenly almost equalling him in rank, and he knew that I would outrank him in a few months. He, of course, would never be more than a Stabsgefreiter regardless how long he stayed in the army. I could sympathise with him, but he was still a little hard to take at times. The Fahnenjunker Gefreiters stayed in the same barracks, and we did the same things as the others, except that on certain days, at certain times, we came together and had special training. The special training made our lives more interesting. Those of us in officer candidate training also had increasingly more contact with the officer corps. They had regular social events, to which we were occasionally invited. The dances were attended by daughters of the older officers and by local business and professional people and their daughters. The dances and social events provided us with excellent opportunities to develop and practice our social skills. We went out with the other enlisted men to help the farmers with their harvest during the latter half of July 1937. It was fun, it was a nice break in routine for us, and it was a great help for the farmers. Of course, we were all accustomed to working with horses, and many of the soldiers were accustomed to farm work. We sang as we went to work in the fields, and we thoroughly enjoyed helping the farmers out. They were very appreciative, and they fed us extremely well. On September 1st, 1937, I was promoted to Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier. On October 1st, after 1 full year in the army, I received a 10-day furlough before reporting to the military academy in Potsdam. Weinreich and I were both assigned to Kriegsschule Potsdam near Berlin. Arrived at Kriegsschule Potsdam in mid-October 1937, looking forward to an exciting new experience. I took a train to Potsdam, a relatively small town near Berlin, and then caught a bus to the school, arriving in late afternoon. Kriegsschule Potsdam was a very large and modern complex, surrounded by a wrought-iron fence on a concrete base. The whole complex looked very military and official. A Gefreiter at the gate inspected my orders and directed me to the administration building. There a clerk directed me to room 17C, where I found a lieutenant seated at a wooden desk. "I am Lieutenant Breaker," he said. "Welcome to Kriegsschule Potsdam. I am going to be your platoon leader while you are here." He sat back down at the desk, opened a folder, and began to look through some papers as I stood before the desk. A photograph of Chancellor Hitler adorned the wall in back of the desk, along with a lithograph of General Feldmarschall von Blomberg, Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht. "You established quite a good record at Jena," the lieutenant commented finally. "I am sure you will do just as well here. You have been assigned to Barrack 3, Suite L. Your training will begin tomorrow morning." I crossed a parade ground to 4 barrack buildings, where I found Barrack 3 and Suite L, and learned that a suite consisted of a large study room with 4 desks and a large bedroom with 4 beds, 4 lockers, and 4 individual washing facilities. Weinreich greeted me at Suite L, a big smile on his face. "Welcome to the manor, Herr Knapper," he said. I looked at him with both surprise and suspicion. "Are we rooming together again?" I asked. "No, I asked the lieutenant if he would put us together," he said with a shrug and a palms-up gesture. He could not, because every suite must have people from different branches of the service. But I am in the suite next door. My other roommates arrived during the afternoon. One was an infantryman named Hans Bottler, another was a cavalryman named Gustav Hoffmann, and I don't remember the 4th one. Since we had no duties for the rest of the day, we all decided to explore the layout of Kriegsschule Potsdam. The parade ground was the centre of the whole complex. On one side of the parade ground were the 4 barrack buildings, and on the other side was the administration building. To one end of the parade ground was the mess hall, which included a lounge where students could have a drink. Behind the barracks were the training area and the stables. Immediately behind the administration building were 4 classroom buildings, and beyond them were an indoor swimming pool, a large gym, and several tennis courts. Overall, the place was quite impressive, with its manicured grounds and neat new brick buildings. After breakfast the next morning, we were all called to an assembly, where we were greeted by the commander of Kriegsschule Potsdam, Oberst Wetzel. We learned that we were but one of 4 Kriegsschules, and that the others were at Munich, Hanover, and Dresden. Anyone who became an officer at that time had to graduate from one of them. Each had approximately 1,000 students. We were then divided into 2 groups of 500 each, labelled Group A and Group B. Suite L was assigned to Group B. Each group was commanded by an Oberstleutnant, Group A by Oberstleutnant Johannes Friesner, and Group B by Oberstleutnant Erwin Rommel. Rommel's name meant nothing to us then, but we would soon learn that he had been quite a hero in the World War, and that even today, at the age of 45, he was something of a celebrity in the German army. His feats of bravery and effectiveness in combat were astounding. We learned that he had received the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest decoration, during the World War as an Oberleutnant in the Alpine Corps on the Italian front. He had been a brilliant tactician even then. He had just this year, 1937, published a book on tactics called Infantry Attacks, which we were to use as a textbook. Once a week we were to have an assembly of both groups, at which Rommel would teach tactics. Within each group were 16 platoons of 32 men each. Each platoon was commanded by a major, who was assisted by a lieutenant. After the commander's presentation, Rommel was introduced and gave a little speech about the importance of a strong officer corps and what an honour it was for us to be selected to become officers in the German army. We were then separated into platoons and introduced to our platoon commanders. Mine was Major Kasnitz, a man of about 40, with thinning hair that was already turning grey. We got another short speech from him. He told us that at the academy we would be taught to lead an infantry battalion in combat. We would all be treated as infantry, even though many of us were in the artillery, the cavalry and the panzers, tanks. Our training began immediately and continued without let-up until Christmas. We studied only military subjects because we were all gymnasium graduates who had just completed 13 years of intensive academic studies. Our major subject was tactics, and we spent most of our time on it. Other subjects included topography and reading maps, engineering, mostly building and blowing up bridges, basic artillery, horseback riding, drilling on the parade ground with rifles, cooperation with the Luftwaffe, and physical education. We spent 6 hours each day in the classroom and 3 hours in the field. We learned everything an infantry battalion commander had to know in any kind of pre-combat or combat situation. At the end of our training, we would theoretically be able to command an infantry battalion in combat. Every week we would have a test that was graded, very much as in gymnasium. We were not normally assigned homework during the week. In the evening we would look over what we had studied during the day and go over it again, so the next day we would be better acquainted with what had been discussed. We got homework every second or third weekend. In an attempt to put us under stress, similar to a combat situation, they gave us very little time to do the assignment. They would give us a situation in which we were a battalion commander. Our battalion was given a certain goal for the day, and we were marching to meet that goal. Suddenly, we would receive a message that the enemy had been spotted. Then we might get a contradictory message. Then we would encounter something else that would alter the situation. The problem was written out, and we would read it as if we were seeing it. From all the information given to us, we had to make our decision. 3 or 4 possibilities might be equally correct. We had to judge the situation and make a decision based on what we knew. We had to write the orders we would give to implement that decision. We had to explain why we made the decision. It was not so much that we had to make a patent decision as how we came to it, how we defended it, and how we executed it. We would go out into the field and play battalion commander. One person would be designated as the battalion commander, and the others would make up his staff. The staff would include an adjutant, an executive assistant to the commander, principally for administrative duties, 3 company commanders, a communications officer, and so on. An assault had to be prepared and orders issued. Major Kasnitz would make the assignments and distribute the rules for playing. Then he would keep notes on how well everyone handled himself. Sometimes the school commander, Oberst Wetzel, would also observe. After the exercise in the field, we would go back to the academy in a bus. Often the most warlike action of the day was the run toward the bus to get one of the better seats. In tactics, we studied how to attack, how to retreat, how to march, and so on. We studied military history, mostly Prussian battles from the 17th and 18th centuries, and battles from the Great World War. We studied how tactics and strategy were used in the battles. Often our 3 hours a day in the field would be infantry practice, for which we would wear our field uniforms, steel helmets, and gas masks. We would march about 20 minutes from the academy, with machine guns and the ammunition for them. We would march and then deploy. We marched 3 abreast. Then, when we came under fire, 1 person went left, 1 went right, and 1 went straight down. We would practice attacking, defending, retreating, and so on. We did this to make sure that everyone knew infantry tactics, even if he was in the artillery or panzers, because tactics usually determined the outcome of a battle. We also did some basic infantry training, like target shooting, firing machine guns, throwing hand grenades, and so on. Sometimes in engineering, we would go out and lay barbed wire and put up anti-tank obstacles. We learned where to apply dynamite to a bridge so it would collapse and not remain usable. We also studied how to deal with mines. We studied all these things both in the classroom and in the field. We had to take riding lessons also, even those of us in the cavalry and artillery who already knew how to ride. Our lives were quite pleasant at Kriegsschule Potsdam. We could study in our room, which was equipped with 4 desks and chairs. The mess hall was not much different from the soldiers' mess at Jena, a large hall with tables for 10 or 12 people each. The mess hall was used only for the noon meal. We were issued a 2-pound loaf of Kommissbrot, or army bread, every other day, which we kept in a special food compartment of our lockers. For breakfast, we would have Kommissbrot, butter, jam, and coffee. Somebody had to go to the mess hall every morning and get the butter, jam, and coffee and bring them back to the suite. For our evening meal, someone would also go to the mess hall to get butter and either liverwurst or cheese to go with our Kommissbrot, and we would also eat this in our suite. We had a lounge adjoining the mess hall where we could go at night and on the weekends and have a drink if we had the time. We could order beer, wine, cognac, or any other kind of drink. On rare occasions, someone would get drunk, but learning to drink socially without getting drunk was part of the training. An army officer who could not hold his liquor would present a bad image. Sometimes we drank a lot if we had something to celebrate, but almost everyone knew how to handle it. As students, we sometimes made excursions away from Potsdam. Major Kasnitz would go with us on these trips because he had to observe us in all kinds of different environments. Some of the excursions were for skiing, a skill considered necessary for winter combat, and others were to visit different battlefields. We made one early trip to East Prussia that lasted 2 weeks. On one trip, we spent a week skiing in the Sudeten Mountains, and I thought often of my trip with Michaelis, Liebeit, Ebert, and Friedrich. At each battlefield, we would study the campaign, and then go and tour the battlefield to get a feel for how these battles were fought: flank attacks, retreats, defence, counter-attacks. We would study the battle in the classroom, and then when we visited the battlefield, one of us would be designated to explain the battle. Then Major Kasnitz would criticise our explanation of the battle. It would be an all-day affair. On the way to a battlefield, we might visit a castle or a fortress. The excursions gave us some historical insights in addition to military insights. We studied the tactics of Alexander and Caesar, the Battle of Hastings, and Roman and Greek battles. We learned why things went right and why things went wrong. Sports were an important part of academy life. Tennis courts were available if we cared to play. Some sports were required, such as swimming, high diving, boxing, fencing, and horseback riding. In addition to enhancing physical fitness, the sports were intended to test our courage and make us competitive. I started training for the modern pentathlon, which consisted of fencing, pistol shooting, horseback riding, 10-kilometre cross-country running, and a 1,000-metre swim. Every day for some time, I ran 10 kilometres and swam 1,000 metres before going to bed. It was terrific training. Others played tennis and swam, and some just went to the lounge and had a drink. Sometimes on the weekends, when we did not have homework, we rented horses and went sightseeing. Potsdam was both colourful and historic, and these excursions were always interesting. Social affairs were arranged so we could practice our social graces and be observed and evaluated. We often had dances to which daughters of the older officers were invited. Anyone who had not learned how to dance properly had to learn now. There were dance schools in Potsdam for those who needed them. The dances were held in a large ballroom with live orchestras. Many of the officers at the Kriegsschule and their wives attended these dances. They were quite formal. The men wore dress uniforms and the women wore ball gowns. There were perhaps 4 dances during the 9 months I was at Potsdam. Major Kasnitz was always watching and evaluating us. His wife and his 2 teenage daughters also attended the dances. At one of the dances, all the 32 men in my platoon were introduced to Rommel's wife. We had to kiss her hand properly and exchange a few words. At Christmas, we got a furlough to go home. Liebeit, Michaelis, and Ebert were, of course, still at the university, and Friedrich was now a lieutenant. Of course, he lorded it over me even more now that he was a full-fledged officer, and I was the Fähnrich. I was beginning to wonder if our relationship would remain this way for the rest of our lives. Shortly before graduation, I was ordered to report to Major Kasnitz's office. When I reported, he returned my salute with a smile and invited me to have a seat. Knappe, in the combined military academies, approximately 4,000 new officers will graduate next week, he said. Jawohl, I said, a bit perplexed. Of those 4,000, your grades place you 24th from the top, he continued. That is no small achievement, and you are to be congratulated. Thank you, Herr Major, I said. But in addition to your grades, your athletic achievements and your demonstrated leadership ability led me to submit your name as a candidate for the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's Award for Outstanding Achievement, he went on. He then stood and extended his hand across his desk. "I am proud indeed to inform you that you have won that prestigious award," he said. "Congratulations." I was dumbfounded, but extremely proud and pleased. "Thank you, Herr Major," I said, shaking his hand. "I am very flattered. I had no idea that you had submitted my name." I titled my photograph album from Potsdam, "Sunny Time at Potsdam." I had really enjoyed the experience. The school had been hard work and it was challenging, but it was also great fun. We all had a lot in common. We were sports-minded and athletic, and we shared a certain intelligence level and a similar education. We were peers and very comfortable with each other. Just before graduation, we were all asked if we would like to volunteer to join the Luftwaffe, which had only recently been formed as a separate branch of the Wehrmacht. I enjoyed the artillery now, had even fallen in love with horses and preferred to stay with it. Since not enough people volunteered, a number of the new graduates were drafted into the Luftwaffe. Among them, much to my chagrin, was Weinreich. I had hoped until then that we would both be assigned to the same unit. Tailor shops were all around the academy in Potsdam, and we all had tailored uniforms made for graduation. We were very proud to be graduating, and we strutted about in our new tailored uniforms. We could wear the officers' insignia on our hats now, but the epaulets on our shoulders were still different. At our graduation ceremony, the commander, his staff, and the students met in an assembly. We heard a few short speeches. Oberst Wetzel made an impassioned speech in which he reminded us that we were part of a proud nation, a proud people, and a proud army. We who were graduating, he said, were a class of destiny, and he expected us to hold our heads high and live up to our country's expectations. I almost shivered with nationalism at his words. Wilhelm Wetzel, link to image, Center, in 1937, as Oberst and Kommandeur of the Kriegsschule in Potsdam. He is flanked by then Oberstleutnant Johannes Friesner and Oberstleutnant Erwin Rommel, commanders of the school's Lehrgruppen A and B, respectively. The ceremony was over in an hour. Then the platoon celebrated a little. Major Kasnitz was not quite as distant as he had been before, and we talked with Lieutenant Brecker on an almost equal basis. A camaraderie was there now, from both of them, that had been missing before. Oberstleutnant Rommel signed my final school record, on which he wrote, "I agree that Knappe should receive the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's award for outstanding achievement." I graduated from the military academy at Potsdam on July 2, 1938, although I was not commissioned as a lieutenant until September. The academy was a tremendous experience for me, and to have won the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's award was a great honour. Except for those assigned to the Luftwaffe, we all returned to the specialties from which we had come, infantry, artillery, panzer, engineers, or whatever, but we were assigned to different bases where nobody had known us as enlisted men. I got a furlough to go home and arrived in time for my parents' 25th wedding anniversary. I wore the formal dress uniform of an Oberfähnrich, complete with sword, and all were very proud of their splendid young soldier. My new assignment was to the 24th Artillery Regiment. Headquarters for the 24th Artillery Regiment was at Altenburg, about 30 miles from Leipzig. 8 of us reported to the regiment from the various Kriegsschules. The next morning, all 8 of us were introduced to Oberst Hartmann, our regiment commander. I knew him by reputation, since I had served under him at Jena, although quite remotely. He was known throughout the 24th Artillery Regiment as the Ice Grey One, because of his grey hair and stern manner. After Hartmann's welcoming speech, we were given our assignments. The 1st Battalion was at Plauen, the 2nd Battalion was at Altenburg, and the 3rd Battalion was at Jena. I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, at Plauen, an industrial city with a population of about 90,000. I had been to Plauen before, but I had never been to the army garrison there. I arrived early so I could familiarise myself with the facilities. The layout was very similar to that of the Jena garrison. The battalion administration building faced the main gate. Extending in a line behind it were 3 barracks buildings, each housing 1 battery. The 3 barracks faced a cobblestone assembly area. A huge training area lay behind the barracks. Behind the training area were two very long and narrow horse stables, and beyond the stables were indoor and outdoor riding arenas. I was greeted by Lieutenant Gerald Niebergall, the battalion adjutant, who told me that I was assigned to 1st Battery, commanded by Hauptmann Dernberg. Hauptmann Kurt Dernberg welcomed me to 1st Battery. "Actually, you are arriving just in time to go on manoeuvres," he said. "You will be our new observation officer, but you will hardly have time to get to know your people before we leave. I will introduce you to our battery officer, Lieutenant Witzleben, at dinner. You and he will need to get to know each other well. You will be working very closely together while we are on manoeuvres, as well as in training new recruits when we return from manoeuvres." Lieutenant Erich Witzleben was about 23 years old, had short blonde hair, a quick smile and an easygoing look about him, and had been in the battery 2 years. "Glad to have you with us," he said when we were introduced. "You will like it here, especially when we get back from manoeuvres. It is a good life." I moved my gear into an officer's apartment in 1st Battery's barracks. The apartment was simple but nicely furnished. I had a bedroom, a small kitchen and a sitting room. Dernberg was married and lived off post. The unmarried lieutenants from the other 2 artillery batteries also had apartments in the barracks. We went on manoeuvres 3 days after I reported to 1st Battery. I was up at 5 o'clock to check out the battery troop and make certain everything was in order. The early morning darkness still held sway at that hour, but the soldiers were stirring. The cook had already been up an hour, had built fires under the kettles on his field kitchen, and had made coffee and tea. The satisfying taste of a cup of hot tea, coupled with the smell of the horses and the clanking of the chains as the horses were being harnessed and hooked up to the carts, guns and wagons, slowly ushered in the light of day. I checked out the equipment of my radio and telephone operators and their horses, as well as the rest of the battery troop. At 7 o'clock, we received the order to pull out and begin the journey to Grafenwehr, where the manoeuvres would be held. It was going to be an all-day march. The 18th Infantry Regiment marched on foot, followed by the 1st Artillery Battalion. Our battery had 4 105 mm guns and all the ammunition and equipment that went with them. Horse-drawn carts also carried supplies, the field kitchens, hay and oats for the horses, and food for the people. We had a blacksmith with his wagon and field forge to replace lost horseshoes and repair equipment. 3 or 4 enlisted men looked after the health of the horses. They were like medical corpsmen for horses. On the way to our destination, we moved on roads. On an uphill grade, the men on the guns, carts and wagons got off and walked in order to make it easier for the horses. Once every hour we stopped for 10 minutes to rest the horses and the marching infantry. At noon, we stopped for an hour to water the horses and feed the men. Each artillery battery and infantry company had its own field kitchen, on which a huge kettle over a fire was used to cook stew as we marched. We stopped again to water the horses and feed the men at about 5 o'clock. We then continued to march, reaching our destination just before dark. We had to position the guns and other equipment, unhook the horses, remove their harness, rub them down, and feed and water them. Then tents had to be erected. It was midnight before we could finally turn in. It had been a very long day, and many men with aching muscles lay down to sleep in the tents that night. Manoeuvres involved 2 divisions, one designated Red Division and the other Blue Division. The 2 divisions were to oppose each other in mock combat. Each division had 3 infantry regiments, and each regiment had 3 battalions of infantry supported by 1 battalion of artillery. The division commander, a general major, would normally keep 1 regiment in reserve, use 1 to feint and try to draw the enemy out of position, and use the remaining regiment to conduct the attack. All the artillery, of course, would be assigned to the infantry regiment making the real attack. We did everything on manoeuvres that we were later to do in combat, even to the extent of building pontoon bridges across the rivers. Umpires judged the battle. They decided which units had been put out of action, how extensive the damage was, and which units were victorious. As much as possible on manoeuvres, officers were housed in local homes in the villages. Families would volunteer guest rooms and be paid for them. If we stayed very long at one place and a restaurant was nearby, we would provide the restaurant with food and pay its staff to prepare and serve it for us for our main meal each day. The soldiers would stay in barns, schools, churches, or whatever larger facilities were available. If nothing else was available, they would stay in tents. If no villages were in the vicinity, officers would live in tents and eat from the field kitchen with the soldiers. Once at the area of manoeuvres, we moved cross-country, just as we would in combat, and the farmers were compensated for any damage to their fences or land. I got to know Dernberg and Witzleben better during manoeuvres because we all had to rely on each other so much. Dernberg, as battery commander, had to approve my selection of my forward observation post and Witzleben's selection of his gun positions. If he did not approve, he would explain why and make the necessary changes. Going to training camps such as Grafenwehr on manoeuvres was good for us because it was the only time we could use live artillery ammunition. Going through the motions of firing the guns in the training area at Plauen was fine, but eventually the men needed to know the exhilaration of firing live ammunition and living under field conditions. Of course, we had to be very careful that no enemy troops were really in the vicinity where the rounds would fall. Manoeuvres lasted a week, and then it was time to return to Plauen. Following manoeuvres, I found that life at Plauen was very pleasant. My bachelor apartment in the barrack was quite comfortable, and I had an orderly who kept it clean and did a little cooking if I had a guest. We worked 10 to 12 hours each day during the week. On Saturday we worked until noon, and then were free until Monday morning unless we had officer of the day duties, which consisted of supervising the guards and in general looking after things. We had such duties about every fourth weekend, and on the other weekends we were free to do as we pleased. I was only about 100 kilometres from home and went home occasionally, but for the most part I found it more interesting to stay in Plauen. Soon after we returned from manoeuvres, Witzleben offered to show me the town. We put on civilian clothing, got into Witzleben's car, and toured Plauen during the afternoon. As always in a new place, I wanted to see the historical places, cathedrals, and interesting architecture. Witzleben was an excellent tour guide, since he'd had 2 years to find all the out-of-the-way places of Plauen. We crisscrossed the whole city, stopping whenever we saw a remarkable building or anything else that caught our attention. Around 5 o'clock, Witzleben announced that he was going to show me his favourite afternoon café. It was common for cafés to play dance music on gramophones in the afternoon, or even to have 2 or 3 musicians playing live dance music. Young men and women would go to the cafés as a way of meeting each other. If a boy saw a girl he wanted to meet, he asked her to dance. Then, if he liked her, he would ask her to join him at his table. The cafés served tea, coffee, beer, wine, and some food. Witzleben drove to the café and parked the car near it. When we went inside, a 3-piece combo was playing dance music. Witzleben immediately saw a girl he knew and led us to her table. "Bettina, it's nice to see you again," he said to a tall, attractive brunette who smiled prettily at him with dancing green eyes. "Hello, Eric," she said. "Permit me to introduce my friend Gisela." Her friend was small, with short blonde hair, blue eyes, and a quick smile. Witzleben introduced me, and the girls invited us to join them. I found Gisela to be very attractive. I danced with her and learned that she was also witty and fun to be with. She was very outgoing, with a bubbly personality. Bettina was more reserved, although both obviously liked having a good time. We enjoyed their company and had a very pleasant evening. On September 1st, 1938, I was ordered to report to our battalion commander, Major Court. I felt sure my commission as a lieutenant had finally been approved. I reported as ordered and found the battalion's other 2 Oberfahrenrichs there as well. Major Court smiled and congratulated us on being promoted to lieutenant. We had been functioning as commissioned officers all along, so all it really meant was that our shoulder epaulettes changed from those of Oberfahrenrich to those of lieutenant. It was nonetheless cause for celebration, and Niebergall, Witzleben and I celebrated late into the night in the officers' mess, along with the other new lieutenants and their friends. There were many social events in Plauen we attended. Plauen was an industrial town with a large upper class that had private clubs where we were always welcome. We were not members of these civilian social clubs because we could not afford to be, but many of the wealthy families had daughters and were glad to have young officers to escort them. For most events in Plauen, we in the officer corps had a standing invitation to attend. A notice would be placed on the battalion's bulletin board, letting us know of coming events. We were part of the social life of the city. Army officers were considered part of the social elite because of a long tradition of the nobility being army officers. Those of us who were not part of the nobility were accepted by association and long tradition. Because of this, we felt a special responsibility when we were in uniform. As soon as we put our uniforms on, we adopted impeccable etiquette. If we wanted to relax, we wore civilian clothing. If it was an official event, or if the battalion commander was to be there, we always wore uniforms. I attended my first social event in late September. Witzleben and I picked up Gisela and Bettina in his car and drove to the dance. Because it was a formal affair at one of the private clubs, and because Hauptmann Dörnberg and Major Kort were going to be there, we wore our dress uniforms. The private club was on the outskirts of Plauen, a few miles away from the post, in a massive ivy-covered brick building. Large pillars with rounded pots on top supported kerosene-fueled lanterns that lit the walkway. As we entered the club, we could hear an orchestra playing. Inside, Witzleben pointed out Hauptmann Dörnberg and Major Kort. They were seated at a large round table and invited us to join them. During the evening I danced with both Frau Dörnberg and Frau Kort. Frau Dörnberg was very proper and said very little. Frau Kort was outgoing and talkative. At one point as we were dancing, she broke into a few steps of the Lambeth Walk, an English dance that was very popular with young people but had been forbidden by the government as degenerate. I was startled at her indiscretion, but she smiled impishly and winked. She apparently enjoyed startling a young officer with her naughtiness. Like young people everywhere, we liked music and we liked to dance. In addition to the Lambeth Walk, some music was also forbidden by the government as degenerate, especially American and British pop music. We could not do the forbidden dances or play the forbidden music in public dance halls, but at the private clubs we would wait for the battalion commander to leave, and then we would do as we liked. There was always a live band, and they always knew the music. I took Gisela to many of the social events in Plauen. As an attractive, fun-loving 18-year-old blonde and the daughter of a wealthy manufacturer, Gisela was very appealing to young officers, and I had a lot of competition for her attention. She and I rode our horses together on weekends and went to riding tournaments together. We also went to theatres and concerts. It was a very happy and carefree time. My army pay was enough to maintain a fairly good standard of living. A lieutenant was paid 300 Reichsmarks, about 70 Wals per month, an Oberleutnant 400 Reichsmarks, about 95, a Hauptmann 500 Reichsmarks, about 119, and a Major 600 Reichsmarks, about 142. Our room and board were also provided. On our pay we could afford to have an inexpensive car and a horse. I was learning that being an officer in the peacetime German army was a very nice life. The new class of recruits arrived in October. Last year's class received promotions to Oberkanonier or Gefreiter, and they would now help train the new class of recruits under 1st Battery's 2 senior Wachtmeisters, Schmundt and Ritter, and their subordinate Unteroffiziers, Obergefreiters and Stabsgefreiters. The soldiers who had completed their 2 years in the army and did not choose to remain in the army for a career were discharged to go home. Lieutenant Witzleben and I divided the responsibility for training the recruits between us. I had the responsibility for Fahrer training, and Witzleben had the responsibility for Kanonier training. Witzleben and I did most of the classroom lectures, and the non-commissioned officers performed the field training. I would go from one training group to the next during the day, either on horseback or on foot, and observe the training being performed by the non-commissioned officers. I would normally just observe, although occasionally, if called upon, I would participate. Once, as I was observing a group on the pistol firing range, the Gefreiter conducting the training invited me to demonstrate for the trainees. I took a pistol and placed 3 rapid shots into the bull's eye. Although I was a good marksman, this was pure luck. Nevertheless, the trainees and the Gefreiter were enormously impressed. Naturally, I did not confess that it was just a stroke of luck. Each artillery officer had 2 horses and an enlisted man called a Förderhalter to care for them. In manoeuvres or combat, the officer rode one of the horses and the Förderhalter rode the other. When the officer dismounted in a combat situation, the Förderhalter took both horses to cover in a woods or valley or creek, where they were protected and could not be seen. If the stop was for a day or 2, he found shelter for the horses. Every year some officers and the veterinarian from each battalion went to horse auctions to buy horses. These were all experienced people who knew horses very well. The horses would be 3 to 4 years old. Each battalion had its own budget, and if we needed 10 riding horses and 12 draft horses, we would try to get the best we could for the money we had to spend. The horses would be completely untrained, and the army would then train them. We had Unterwachtmeisters who did that constantly under the direction of a lieutenant or a Wachtmeister. Officers spent a small part of their time training their own horses. We could buy our own horses, train them, and then sell them for a profit. Most artillery and cavalry officers did that each year. We could buy an untrained horse for about 1,500 Reichsmarks and sell a well-trained horse for 4,000. It provided a nice extra income. We had the fun and gained the experience of training the horses, and the army was happy with the arrangement as well. We did the training as part of our regular duties. I did not really know enough to buy my own horse at this time, so I had a Hauptmann who was an expert at judging horses buy one for me near Hanover. I just had to buy the horse and the saddle. The government would pay for its upkeep, and I would have a soldier to take care of it. When my horse was led from the van, I was impressed. He was a 4-year-old chestnut gelding named Swabian Prince. Frightened from the strange experience of the train ride, he came off the van sweaty, wide-eyed, and snorting loudly. I talked to him in soothing tones and rubbed his neck and shoulders and calmed him somewhat. I stayed with him in his stall for some time, just talking to him and petting him. During the training period, I visited him every day, talked to him, brushed him, and led him a little. I worked him on the line, teaching him the basics, but I also added some small 1-foot jumps. I wanted a well-schooled jumper, so I began the process early. Then several of us who were training our own horses would take them together into the riding arena so they would get used to other horses. When the time finally came for me to mount him, he accepted my weight without resistance, even though he was obviously very nervous about the new experience. He knew me well, and I had taken ample time to prepare him for this moment. Then I began a program of an hour of riding every day. Then came the occupation of the Sudetenland, a part of pre-World War Germany that had been given to Czechoslovakia by the Versailles Treaty, and that was still heavily populated by ethnic Germans. As early as May, while I was still at Kriegsschule Potsdam, the newspapers had been full of stories about the abuse of the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland by the Czechoslovakian government. The stories had continued through the summer and become increasingly worse. We did not know, of course, that much of it was the creation of Goebbels's propaganda machine. The only news we received was from the controlled press, and it never occurred to us to question it. At the Nuremberg rally in 1938, Hitler had threatened to see to it that the Czechs gave justice to the Sudeten Germans. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had been negotiating with Hitler since mid-September. In a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, Hitler had announced that he would have the Sudetenland by October 1st, even if he had to take it militarily. We received orders to be prepared to march and were moved up to the Czech border on September 26th. I recalled Herr Hofer's gloomy predictions of war barely 30 months earlier, as we now prepared to invade the Sudeten area near where I had met him. I had seen some of the Czech fortifications on skiing trips in the Ore Mountains. Plauen was only 35 kilometres from the Czechoslovakian border, and the best skiing area was just across the border. Then, on September 29th, Hitler and Prime Minister Chamberlain met again, along with Daladier of France and Mussolini of Italy. On September 30th, the announcement was made that Czechoslovakia had accepted our peaceful occupation of the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. The occupation was to begin October 1st and be completed by October 10th. We all felt that we had righted a wrong that had been done to us by the Versailles Treaty. We were ordered to be ready to pull out at 7 a.m. on October 1st. I was up at 5 to see that everything was done properly and went smoothly. The cook's hot tea was a real bracer against the early morning chill at this time of year. The horses were fed and watered, and then the men were fed. The big difference between this operation and manoeuvres was that this time the men were issued live ammunition for their rifles. We did not expect resistance, but the issue of live ammunition had a sobering effect on everyone. All the units were lined up, and precisely at 7 Sass we pulled out. We followed the roads instead of going cross-country, which means that we went south first and then turned east into Czechoslovakia. Although we did not expect resistance, we had full equipment, were well trained, and could have gone into battle if necessary. As it turned out, the Sudeten Germans we encountered all greeted us enthusiastically, and we did not encounter any Czech army units. They had apparently withdrawn from the Sudetenland prior to October 4. I felt comfortable in the Sudetenland because I had skied here so many times. We went into Czechoslovakia only 35 to 70 kilometres all along the border. On October 5th, 1938, we went into quarters in a village near Carlsbad, Czechoslovakia. Everything was quiet and all the news was good. I was quartered with several other officers, including Niebergall, Dernberg and Witzleben. The 4 of us met at a village restaurant for our noon meal. "Everything has gone perfectly so far," Dernberg said with obvious satisfaction. "This is a good demonstration of the value of constant training. It has been just like a manoeuvre." "I think we should celebrate our victory," Witzleben suggested, always ready for a party. "So far, not a single casualty." "Good idea," agreed Niebergall with a smile. "I nominate Knappe to find some champagne or good wine for the celebration, since the rest of us outrank him." "I guess that is the price you must pay for being youngest, Knappe," Dernberg said. After lunch, I tried to find wine in the village and discovered that none was available. The village was too small, and I would have to go to a larger town to get champagne or wine. I decided to take a motorcycle and go to the next town, which was about a 30-minute ride. I put some saddlebags onto a motorcycle, started the motor, and headed down a gravel road toward the next town. The next thing I was aware of was being in a hospital room. I could not imagine where I was until a nurse came into the room and I asked her. I learned that I was in a military hospital at Grafenwehr, back in Germany. I learned only later what had apparently happened. All that was known was that the battalion veterinarian later that day went down that same road and found me lying near a culvert, unconscious, with the motorcycle nearby. He returned and sent an ambulance for me. It took me to the military hospital at Grafenwehr, about 90 kilometres northeast of Nuremberg. The nurse told me I had been unconscious for 36 hours. The last thing I remembered was leaving on the motorcycle. It was a gravel road, and I must have lost control of the motorcycle on the loose gravel. A cement milestone was on the road near where they found me, and I must have hit my head on that. Fortunately, I was wearing my steel helmet, or I would probably have been killed. I had no broken bones, no cuts, and just a few bruises. I did not even have a headache. I found it hard to believe that the incident had even occurred. I had felt worse after my first full day in the saddle. The doctor refused to let me return to my unit because I had had a concussion, and as standard procedure I had to lie flat for 3 weeks. Then I was allowed to return to Plauen, but not to active duty. I went to Leipzig for several days of convalescent leave near the end of October, once I was permitted to travel. My brother, Fritz, seemed to be almost disappointed that we had not had to fight our way into the Sudetenland. "Didn't you see any Czech soldiers?" he asked incredulously. "None," I assured him. "If I had not rammed my head into that milestone, there probably would not have been any violence at all." Our regiment returned to Plauen around November 1st and held a victory parade. By then I was out of the hospital and back in my barracks apartment, but I was still convalescing and had to watch the parade from my apartment window. I took some ribbing from Witzleben and others about that. Just after my return to duty, Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, occurred. A young German Jew whose family had been sent to concentration camps had walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot to death a minor German official. In retribution, the Nazi brownshirts during the night of November 9th rampaged across Germany, burning synagogues and destroying stores, buildings and apartments belonging to Jews. In a few places, Jews were killed when they tried to resist, and many were wounded. The event was called Crystal Night because of the broken windows. I hoped fervently that Michaelis was not among them. It was reported on the radio and in the newspapers as a spontaneous expression of moral outrage by the German people. It was nothing of the kind, of course, and everyone knew it. We did not talk about it in the barracks, because we were ashamed that our government would permit such a thing to happen. We did not want to admit it to ourselves, much less to each other, so we did not talk about it. Strong anti-Semitism had always been just beneath the surface in the German population, but no one I knew supported this kind of excess. We all felt that Hitler had been very good for Germany solving unemployment, eliminating political street brawls, restoring national pride, but there was a coarseness about him that we silently abhorred. His hatred of the Jews made no sense to any of us, and we just wanted to distance ourselves from the ugly side of his character. Herr Hoffer's face appeared to me in a dream that night, a dream that was haunted by the refrain, "At what cost?" St. Barbara's Day, on December 4th, was always a festive time for us. St. Barbara was the patron saint of miners and artillerymen. The officer corps staged a celebration with a sketch about the occupation of the Sudetenland that numbered me among the casualties, along with a chicken and a young rabbit, both of which had been run over by ammunition carts. It was embarrassing, but it was also funny. On Christmas 1938, one stayed in Plauen as duty officer, another price I had to pay for being the youngest officer in the battery. During my New Year's furlough, Friedrich, Ebert, Liebelt, Michaelis and I got together again. But this one was not a happy meeting. It started off well enough, but as the evening progressed, Michaelis became more and more quiet. Finally, I asked him why. "We have to leave Germany," he said softly, "and it is the only home I have ever known." "Why do you have to leave?" Friedrich asked. "Because we are Jewish. The brownshirts destroyed my father's medical office during Kristallnacht, and his patients are afraid to come to him now. They are afraid of what the brownshirts might do to them." Silence fell over the group. We avoided one another's eyes, trying to think of something we could say that would not sound hypocritical. "That is awful," Ebert said finally. "It feels so different when it happens to someone you know." "Let's not let it get us down tonight," Michaelis said, shaking his head and attempting to smile. "It will be my last night with my friends. Let's enjoy it." It was the last time any of us ever saw Michaelis. His family went to England, where he probably continued his studies. In February 1939, one received an order to report to Major Court. "Come in," he responded to my knock. He returned my salute and motioned for me to take a seat. "This came for you today," he said, handing me a piece of paper. It was an invitation to a reception being given by Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. "Your performance at Kriegsschule Potsdam has earned you this honor," Court said, smiling. "Only the top graduates from the 4 Kriegsschule are invited. My congratulations." Court was obviously pleased at having one of his officers going to the reception. It was an exciting experience. We young officers all met in a foyer off the large reception room in the new Reich Chancellery and waited there. In a large coat room for visitors was a General Feldmarshal's baton and a big hat with a lot of gold braid that obviously belonged to Hermann Göring. One of the other young lieutenants took Göring's baton, put his hat on, and started strutting around with his belly stuck out, imitating Göring. We all enjoyed that immensely and threatened to blackmail him at some future date. Nobody was there but us, of course, and we waited in this foyer until we were called into the vast main room, where we were served champagne. The room was furnished with green leather chairs, and there was a lot of marble. It was tastefully done, with many sculptures and paintings. All the top army brass were there, Göring, von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the army, and others. Himmler and other high-ranking politicians were also there. All the famous leaders looked just as they did in the newsreels. It was quite a heady experience for a 22-year-old officer. We were standing around in groups, just chatting with each other, when Hitler came in. The room felt charged with his presence as he began drifting from group to group, making small talk. We gave our names to Hitler's military aide, a major, who then introduced us to Hitler. General Walter von Brauchitsch, Leutnant Knapper, the major said to Hitler when they came to me. Hitler smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Good evening, Lieutenant," he said. "I am happy to meet you. Where are you from?" "I am from Leipzig, mein Führer," I said. "And where are you stationed?" "At Plauen, in the 24th Artillery Regiment." "Congratulations on your performance at Kriegsschule," Hitler said as he moved on. Hitler was at the height of his power. Everything Lai had done had turned out in his favour. The reoccupation, the Rhineland, the build-up of the armed forces, the annexation of Austria, the takeover of the Sudetenland. He radiated enthusiasm and energy to everyone in the room. Everything he had done except annexing Austria had been to correct an injustice that had been imposed on us by the Treaty of Versailles, and Austria had been annexed by plebiscite of the Austrian people. He made us extremely proud to be young German officers, and I am sure he sensed that pride in us. We lieutenants enjoyed the reception greatly. Although we were really very proud to be there, we treated it like a joke among ourselves. A couple of the lieutenants drank a little too much champagne, and the rest of us had to protect them because that would have reflected badly on the army. On March 15, 1939, the German army invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, unopposed, but my unit was not part of that operation. Now, for the first time, I experienced moral reservation about my government's action. The Sudetenland had been taken from us, but our subjugation of all of Czechoslovakia was unprovoked, and I saw no justification for it. In May 1939, a national riding tournament was held at Bad Elster, which was nearby, and so more of us went than would have otherwise. We could have our horses walked there the day before the event rather than having to ship them. It was a very social event, an opportunity for well-to-do riders to compare horses and talents. A 2-day affair, it was planned throughout the year by the social elite. Although I was quickly eliminated, I enjoyed the event greatly. In June, I received a letter from my brother, Fritz, who was serving an apprenticeship with a merchant in Lunenburg, asking if he would be permitted to visit me for a weekend. I invited him to come and began to plan a weekend with him. I checked out a 2-horse carriage, had my orderly drive it, and wore a dress uniform to meet him. He arrived at a little past noon on a Saturday. He was 17 years old, and his whole face lit up when he saw the carriage, the horses, the driver, and my dress uniform. I took him to the stables to meet Schwaben Prince. He was impressed that I had trained Schwaben Prince myself, and that I had participated in a jumping tournament. We changed to civilian clothes after dinner that evening and drove to town with Witzleben and Niebergall. Fritz was impressed with all the girls there, and he danced every dance, although he managed to sip enough wine between dances to get just a little tipsy. We all enjoyed him, and he had a memorable time. After lunch at the officers' mess the next day, I borrowed Witzleben's car and drove Fritz to the train station. We had both thoroughly enjoyed the weekend together. There were now more and more warning signs that war was getting closer. The Polish Corridor, a strip of Germany that had been given to Poland by the Versailles Treaty in order to provide her with a port on the Baltic Sea, separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and Hitler seemed determined to regain it, as well as the former German city of Danzig, which had been made a free city by the Versailles Treaty. More and more, however, it looked as if an invasion of Poland would not be as easy as Hitler's earlier conquests had been. France and England were now publicly stating that they would fight if we invaded Poland, and events seemed to be leading inevitably to such an invasion. I recalled Herr Hofer. Was Hitler about to take the gamble that would prove fatal? We were all startled, if not shocked, by the announcement of a German-Soviet non-aggression pact late in the evening of August 21st. The government had always preached against the Soviet Union, and suddenly overnight, the countries were friends. We did not know what to make of it. Goebbels's propaganda tried to put a positive face on it by reporting the importance of the raw materials we were to get from the Soviet Union. Yet nothing could logically explain such a total and abrupt reversal. We young officers were troubled by the strange behaviour of our government, but we felt that it was not our place to question such political decisions. On August 27, 1939, the government announced the rationing of food, soap, shoes, textiles, and coal. The German newspapers and radio were reporting extremely serious provocations by the Poles. They made it appear that Poland was about to attack Germany, and we had no reason to doubt what we were being told. It was getting very serious, and now we felt certain that war would come. We felt, however, that if it came, we could deal with it. We were highly trained and ready. I had grown accustomed to army life, and I enjoyed it. I was no longer thinking about studies or going to a university as I had right after gymnasium. I had decided to make the army my career. Then late in August 1939, we were placed on war alert. The American DC-3 cargo plane on which I was being taken to Moscow landed at Minsk for a brief layover after 3 hours of flight. The Russian passengers and crew left the airplane after posting a guard with a submachine gun to guard me. I sat on the rolls of carpet, and images of going through Minsk during our invasion of Russia in 1941 crowded my mind. If anyone had told me at that time that exactly 4 years later we would have lost the war to Russia, and I would be on my way to Moscow as a prisoner of war. By invading Russia in 1941, we had transformed her from a very poor and backward country to a world power. I sat lost in my thoughts as my guard and I waited for the Russian crew and passengers to return to the airplane. After an hour or so, the airplane took off again on the final leg of the flight to Moscow. As we flew through the sky over the endless Soviet Union, my thoughts returned to the beginning of the war in 1939. Reserves were called up in late August, and the Plauen garrison was placed on alert on August 28th. All furloughs were cancelled, and no one could leave his unit. At 8 o'clock on the morning of August 31st, Major Court presided at a meeting of his staff, the officers of all 3 batteries that reported to him. "Gentlemen," he began without preliminaries, "we have received orders to load on trains this evening. I am sure I do not have to tell you what that means." He paused to let us consider the significance of the statement, then quickly continued. "Our battalion is as close to a perfect fighting unit as training can make it," he added. "Every officer, every man, and every horse has been trained for a specific function, and has practiced that function until it is instinctive. I am confident that we shall acquit ourselves well in combat. However, we must leave 20% of our people behind to form the nucleus of a new artillery battalion. That means 20% of the men, plus 1 officer from each battery. Lieutenant Niebergall will also stay behind to provide an experienced adjutant for the new battalion commander. New battery commanders will be drawn from the reserves that are being called up. Horses for the new battalion are being appropriated now from their civilian owners. Both the new horses and the reserve troops will begin arriving tomorrow. Those who are leaving must begin immediately to prepare for departure early this afternoon. Those who are remaining should help the rest of us prepare for departure today and prepare to receive the new men and horses tomorrow. I suggest we begin immediately." Court stood up. "Good luck to all of you," he said. Almost immediately the post erupted with hectic activity. As the officer from my battery who was selected to stay, I helped Witzleben and Dernberg separate the 20% of the men who were staying from the 80% who were going and helped get the horses and equipment ready for their departure. Before dawn the next morning, September 1, 1.5 million German soldiers crossed the Polish border and were soon engaged in combat. Our new battalion and battery commanders arrived during the day. First to arrive was Major Rack, who was to replace Court as battalion commander. My new battery commander was a reserve officer in his 40s named Hauptmann Wimmer. He was well over 6 feet and slender, with dark hair and heavy dark eyebrows that made his face expressive. In the afternoon, Major Rake called a meeting of all battalion officers. He looked us all over. "Gentlemen, we have exactly 3 days to get ready for a move," he said. "We will move by train, pulling out at 7 a.m. on September 4th. I realize that you do not know each other, and this is going to be a difficult operation. I suggest that you get to know each other quickly." Lieutenant Rehberg was our new forward observation officer. He was just out of Kriegsschule Dresden. Hauptmann Wimmer called a meeting of Rehberg, me, and our new Hauptwachtmeister Schnabel that evening. "Gentlemen, we are all new to each other, but we must become a smoothly working team very quickly," Wimmer began. He puffed on an elaborately carved ivory pipe with a curved stem of deer horn. "Not only must we receive approximately 150 new men, but we must also receive an equal number of horses. The men are at least trained and need only to learn to work together as a battery. We will have to train the horses if we are given time to train them before we are in combat." A shiver ran over my body involuntarily at his statement. I had been practicing for combat for the past 3 years, but now that I was confronted with the prospect of facing it in a few days, the word combat almost seemed to take on a new meaning, a meaning with much greater intensity and urgency. But it also carried a sense of excitement, for I was young, and my nationalistic fervour was high. "Get a good night's rest, gentlemen," Wimmer concluded, smoke from his pipe curling past his face. "We have some hard days ahead of us." His dark, heavy eyebrows seemed to add solemnity to the words. The next morning, both horses and men began arriving. I mounted Schwabenprinz and took a look around in the breaking dawn. Horses were being led into the compound and tied in the stables randomly. The clomping of metal horseshoes on cobblestone sounded everywhere. Schwabenprinz sensed the excitement, and I had to rein him in. Reserve troops, who were arriving in large numbers, were milling around and waiting for orders, their conversation creating an incoherent murmur in the early morning air. Lieutenant Niebergall was trying to establish order in the barracks area, ordering troops to assemble in the mess hall until they could be assigned to a barrack. Wimmer and Schnabel began to organize the arrival of men and horses. I began attempting to form gun crews of the arriving men, and Rehberg began identifying and cataloguing the arriving horses. We replaced all the men and horses that had been sent to Poland. The government even appropriated the horses we officers owned and paid us for them and the saddles they wore, although we were permitted to keep them. The purpose of this move was so that if a horse was killed in battle, the government would take the financial loss rather than the officer. I was very happy to be able to keep Schwabenprinz. I had trained him myself, and we had been through countless manoeuvres together, and it was a comfort to have my own familiar horse. Lammers, my orderly, was also staying, and I was equally glad that I would not have to adjust to a new one. The process of getting ready to move out in such a short time was hectic. I spent my time overseeing preparations for moving the guns, ammunition carts, ammunition wagons, field kitchen, blacksmith's forge wagon, and other equipment. Rehberg did the same for the horses. I was barely able to touch base occasionally with Wimmer, Rehberg, and Schnabel, who were all as busily engaged as I was. On September 3rd, the worst news came. Great Britain and France had declared war on Germany. It was indeed to be another great war. Herr Hofer had been right after all, and we would certainly not be able to deny that we had started this one. We had subjugated Czechoslovakia without provocation, and now we had invaded Poland, even though it was done to regain Danzig and the Polish corridor, which had been taken from us by the Treaty of Versailles. After checking out the horses and then the equipment that evening, Rehberg and I went to the officers' club to have a drink and relax before turning in. There we found Wimmer and Schnabel at a table, going over the plans for our departure the next morning. We joined them in reviewing the plans. After a while it dawned on me that no one had questioned, or even thought about, the presence of a Hauptwachtmeister in the officers' club, deeply engaged in conversation with the officers of his battery. This, I thought, portended well for the future. An army unit that worked together that closely should be a very good one, it seemed to me, and a Hauptwachtmeister who accepted that much responsibility on his own initiative was surely an outstanding one. The next morning, the entire infantry regiment was ready to move out by 6 a.m. The 3 battalions of infantry went first, on foot, to the train station. Trains were scheduled 1 hour apart, and each infantry battalion took up 10 cars in a train. Although 2 trains could take all 3 infantry battalions, each artillery battery required a separate train because of the horses and equipment. The infantry was scheduled to depart from the train station at 7 Chius, and trains were scheduled for the 3 artillery batteries at 8 U's, 9 Schiens and 10 Schiens. The trains and all other logistics had been planned and scheduled by the division's operations officer. We had only to arrive at the designated times, and the trains would be waiting. Since my battery was scheduled for the second train, we pulled out of the Plauen garrison for the railroad station at 7 Naum and arrived at the train station at 7:45. Predictably, loading the horses proved to be the biggest problem, because most of them were farm horses that had never seen a train and were frightened by all the noise and commotion. I helped Rehberg and his men with their loading. Some of the horses were so frightened that we had to blindfold them and have 2 men lock arms behind them and physically shove them into the railroad cars. Getting the horses loaded without injury was tedious work. We finally got everything and everybody aboard, and the train pulled out at 8:12 a.m. Our train had 24 cars, 15 for horses, 3 for troops, and 6 for guns, carts and wagons. Once the train was rolling, I was finally able to take a deep breath and try to review the frenzied activity of the last 2 days. The future quickly pushed the past out of my mind, however, and I found myself thinking about all the training we had to do once we arrived at our destination, which I now knew was our border with Luxembourg, if the French and British would give us time for it. The horses would have to be evaluated quickly. Having pulled ploughs and farm equipment hardly qualified them to become part of a 6-horse artillery team. Our human resources were also a concern. Having been on manoeuvres many times, I knew only too well how many things could go seriously wrong if a team did not function well as a unit. If we were attacked, however, I felt that the men were well trained and would be able to fight defensively. Arriving at the Mosel River near Koblenz at 6:01 p.m., we found unloading to be much easier than loading had been. Even frightened horses were easier to get out of a rail car than into one. We disembarked in the Mosel Valley at Cochem, at the foot of the Eifel Mountains. We would march the rest of the way by roads tomorrow after spending the night in tents. We tethered the horses after watering and feeding them, posted guards, pitched tents, and fed the men before turning in at approximately 10 p.m. We bedded down under the stars, to the musical gurgling of purling water in the nearby river, and to the chirping of crickets and the croaking of frogs. Here and there fireflies announced their presence in the darkness. The familiar sounds of the horses, the snorting and stomping and chomping, as well as the smell of them, made us feel at home as we drifted off to sleep in the night air. We were up at 5:30 the next morning. After our usual morning ritual when we were on the road, we pulled out at 7. Although the Eifel Mountains were not high, the roads were nonetheless all uphill with rough terrain, and the men walked instead of riding on the guns and carts. The mountains were pretty, but they could make manoeuvring difficult because at certain points the road was quite narrow. It would have normally been a 3-hour climb, but one of the lead ammunition carts broke a wheel after we had been on the move about 2 hours. I sent a messenger ahead to tell Hauptmann Wimmer we would all be delayed, since nothing else could get past the broken-down cart. Then I sent to the rear for the blacksmith, Obergefreiter Max Knecht. While Knecht and his assistant worked on the ammunition cart, I went to the field kitchen for a cup of tea to pass the time. Our cook was Unteroffizier Josef Bolt, who had heavy dark eyebrows that ran together to form one long eyebrow. We were on our way again in a little less than an hour. We continued our march uphill for another hour before being stopped again. I sent a messenger ahead to find out why, and learned that some trees had been felled across the road a couple of days earlier to block an invasion by the French and British. We waited the best part of another hour while the people ahead of us cleared away the barricade. We finally arrived at our destination around noon. We were about 5 kilometres east of the Luxembourg border, just northwest of Bleialf and Winterspelt, in a heavily wooded sector. A stream that we could use for washing and watering the horses ran nearby. Hauptmann Wimmer issued orders to set the guns into firing position, pointed toward the border and to camouflage them. We ordered the horses taken back to Bleialf and telephone lines laid between the forward observation post and the gun positions. We had not been given any information about the big picture, how many divisions strong we were, or how many French and British divisions might be opposite us. Luxembourg and Belgium were between us and France, but we did not doubt that the French and British would march through those countries if they were to invade Germany, just as we had during the World War. That would be a sensible thing for them to do, because if they tried to come over the Rhine River, the Luftwaffe would be an added worry for them. They would be vulnerable crossing a wide river over which bridges would have been destroyed. They would be trapped in a bottleneck and become perfect targets from the air. We thought combat was imminent, and we went about our duties very grimly in that expectation. We established a guarded perimeter area and immediately began digging in. The smell of freshly dug earth mingled with the natural odour of the decaying leaves of the forest in the warm September afternoon. Soon the odour of sweating bodies was added to the others. After digging foxholes, the men began building bunkers. We had no idea how long we might be here, but nobody liked living in a foxhole or a tent. The men cut down small trees to build bunkers. They trimmed the limbs off the trees, stood the trunks on end, side by side, and chinked between them with mud. The odour of the chinking mud had an unpleasantness about it. The men built a bunker for the forward observation post first, then bunkers for the officers, and then bunkers for themselves. The bunkers were usually dug into the side of a hill with a door and a window in the front. The men rigged bunks with pole frames for themselves in the bunkers, 7 or 8 men to a bunker. Rehberg moved into our forward observation bunker. As battery officer, my bunker was about 3 kilometres back from the forward observation post, with the guns. Of course, the guns and the bunkers were all camouflaged, so they could not be detected from the air. It took us only 2 days to get our field position battle ready. Lammers made my bunker quite livable under the primitive circumstances. Major Ruck came by to inspect our position and complimented us on our fast work. He also brought word of the first casualties in Poland among the men who had served with us at Plauen. One was a forward observation officer who was badly wounded by fire from his own battery when a round fell short and hit his observation post. The news had a chilling effect on me, not only because I knew him, but because it could just as easily have been me had fate sent me to Poland with my old battery. The news made war considerably more real for us. We immediately began a vigorous training program to train the horses and to get the men accustomed to working together. We practiced all day, every day, to try to achieve the cohesiveness necessary to fight in an offensive operation if that should be ordered. The stress of not knowing when we might be attacked was incentive enough to drive the men to work hard to become an effective fighting unit. We had trained for combat, and with confidence born of youth and innocence, I did not consider the possibility of being killed or mutilated in combat. Our daily routine was constant training. The mountainous terrain made training particularly difficult. Level ground was all but non-existent, and both men and horses had to work harder. At least the late summer weather was dry, so we did not have to deal with rain and slippery footing. Days passed, and the French did not attack. Wimmer, Rehberg and I, as well as a great many others, I am sure were grateful that the French and British were giving us time to get our horses and troops ready before they attacked. Each day of training raised our confidence level. More days passed, and still no attack. By the time that 2 weeks had passed, the troops were beginning to make jokes about it. Niebergall came by one evening and joined Wimmer, Rehberg and me for a drink. He gave us the latest news from Poland. Things were going great there.